Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang and I'm the founder and host of Undocumented History and online YouTube video podcast. Welcome to episode 10. In today's episode, we have a very special guest, Professor Jeung. He is the co-founder of StopAAPIHate, the largest reporting center tracking Asian hate, and also a professor at the San Francisco State University, where he teaches in the Asian American Studies department. Asian Americans are the least likely group to seek professional mental health services. This could be due to a result of reasons, discrimination and cultural values. However, according to Professor Jeung, this statistic is a result of Asian Americans not conforming to Western ideas of seeking mental health services and instead turning inwards to their own culture to look for resources regarding mental health. In this conversation, Professor Jeung and I will discuss the intersection of race and gender, how to provide support for AAPI victims of Asian hate, and also how to turn inwards to look for mental health resources. Here is my conversation with him. Okay, so I guess my first question would be kind of asking you to describe the trend of Asian hate pre-pandemic, during the pandemic to now. Has it kind of decreased, increased, or stayed relatively the same?
Yeah, the degree to which Asians experience racism, I think actually was pretty constant for a while. Pre-pandemic, it's hard to say. We didn't really have a baseline, but I think regular microaggressions occurred and, kids got bullied. But during COVID, there was a clear surge in racism, really exacerbated by the political rhetoric and COVID-19. Currently, it's hard to say. I think US-China animosities, Islamophobia, both still stir up anti-Asian hate. We still experience a lot of microaggressions and attacks. So it does wax and wane, but I think overall the current situation is still pretty bad for Asians in America.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess kind of going on to your organization, I guess what does Stop API Hate do? And I guess what is Stop API Hate doing to combat Asian hate?
Well, I'm no longer with Stop AAPI Hate, but what it does is it again collects data on accounts of racism and then reports out on what's happening and then tries to seek long-term solutions to the racism. It recognizes that hate isn't just interpersonal acts of prejudice, but also institutionalized, is historic. And so Stop AAPI Hate, I think, tries to address policies that help bring about long-term solutions to racism.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess kind of transitioning into hate for specific Asian hate for specific groups. I know that Asian American women are more at risk for anti-Asian attacks than men. I guess can you talk a little bit about how the intersection of race and gender and the stereotypes of Asian women in the media play into this statistic?
Sure. So Asian Americans as a group experience racism, but men and women and people of different sexualities experience that racism differently. A lot of that difference is based on the media stereotypes portrayed by Hollywood. And in the past, and even currently, Asian women are treated as hypersexualized. They're fetishized for being either lotus blossoms who are docile and submissive, or ladies who are, again, hypersexualized and dangerous. In either form, again, they're seen as objects, not as real people. And because of that, people can get the stereotype, the idea that they're have certain qualities that may make them more attractive, but also, again, can also objectify them. And so combining both their Asian racial identity and their gendered identity, then Asian women may experience a more virile hatred, maybe a more objectification that then leads them to be treated differently than others.
Mm-hmm. And I know with the Atlanta spa shootings, the shooter said that he had a sex addiction, and I guess that kind of played into things because Asian women, as you said, are hypersexualized in the media and stuff.
Yeah, it's really disturbing and sad that, yeah, if he had a sexual addiction, he could have gone anywhere to satisfy that addiction, but instead he drove hours out of his way to go to an Asian American spa and then drove again to another spa. So I think, yeah, you can say that it wasn't any racial intent, but it's clear that he took the time and purpose to go to a specific type of spa.
And especially, yeah, as you said, like even if I guess like even if there if you think that there's like no racial intent beside it, the media and like the hypersexualization of Asian American women definitely did kind of play into that. And I guess my next question would kind of be like, was the hate against Asians during the pandemic similar to like what Asians experienced with the Chinese Exclusion Act and like the Japanese concentration camps?
Yeah, I think the racism against Asian Americans take a particular form that are different from maybe the racism that Blacks face or other groups face. Um, Asians are seen as perpetually foreign, as aliens who don't belong into the United States. And that stereotype that we're outsiders um, also fits into this broader stereotype of being the yellow peril, that as a perilous group we're dangerous and threatening and therefore need to be excluded. So during the Chinese Exclusion Act, we were seen as threats to the Americas economy, and so we were excluded. During World War II, Japanese Americans were seen to be threats to the nation's national security, so they were incarcerated. So in 2020, Asians were seen to be a threat to America's public health, and so we were harassed, attacked, and scapegoated. And so you see a pattern of us being seen as dangerous, as threatening to the nation's health, economy, national security, and therefore we're treated as being foreigners who don't belong, foreigners who need to be segregated, foreigners who need to be excluded. And African Americans, this is an interesting point, that they had to face domestic segregation because people didn't want to be with them. And in the same way, through these exclusion laws, Asians were internationally segregated from the United States, that we were actually, again, separated from white America through immigration laws. So the acts of exclusion through discrimination are similar, but Asians are more foreign and therefore segregated in an international, trans-Pacific way.
And I also think this kind of stems from like I guess just like the lack of education surrounding Asian American history. I feel like if you don't learn about Asian American history, then you're less likely to also teach it. And I think that kind of like stems into like like a cycle perpetuating like just like lack of education surrounding Asian American history. And also something that you said before with like just like the racism against Asian Americans, I think some people feel that is as if Asian Americans don't experience like as much racism or they don't really experience racism at all because of the model minority myth. But I feel like the model minority myth itself does like perpetuate the racism because people think that I guess like Asian Americans are like very good and like are an example of like a good like minority group, but then that kind of plays into the racism because they can use that as like kind of like an excuse for like their own like microaggressions or whatnot.
Yeah, a lot of Asian Americans, a lot of my students talk about the model minority myth as being really detrimental in three different ways. The model minority myth is that Asians are the model group that other racial groups should copy and emulate because we're hardworking, we're educationally oriented, and we're just quiet and achievement oriented. That really hurts. Well, first of all, it's detrimental because it's not necessarily true that a lot of Asian Americans don't do well, need help. And because they're seen as the model minority and they're quiet, they don't get the help they need, right? And so that's pretty painful. A lot of us aren't doing well. A lot of us are poor. A lot of us don't do well in school. And what happens then is that this stereotype masks the problems that Asians have, right? You talked about how Asians experience a lot of racism, but people aren't aware of it. People don't deal with it because we're seen as, oh, they're a minority group that has no problems. And by saying that we're doing well, again, masks the racism we experience. If a kid's not doing well and it's just quiet, teachers may not know that that student needs help, may be depressed. The second problem is that it's unfair to other groups, right? Because other groups are said, why can't you be like Asians? It vilifies the other groups for being the cause of their own problems. And so that drives a wedge between Asians and other groups because other groups hold resentment. And the third problem with the model minority is that I think it creates a standard for students that they can't even attain, that no one really is the model, that I know my students feel like they face a lot of pressure and academic stress to achieve a certain standard. And oftentimes you always feel like you need to be perfect, and that leads to a lot of pressure. So any stereotype is racist and problematic because it deprives us of our humanity and just puts us in a category. And so I know my students feel really boxed in. They either feel like they have to live up to the model minority or they have to really react against it, which is really hard, because to react against a model minority, you have to say, oh, I'm stupid, I'm not that hardworking. And that's like, who wants to say that about themselves? So to say that Asian Americans don't experience racism isn't true. I think everybody in the United States experiences racism. White people experience racism because everybody holds stereotypes. You can name them really easily, and people are treated based on those stereotypes. So Asians may not be aware, but they are racially profiled. People see them, as being smart and being hardworking. That's a stereotype that you're categorized with, and you're facing discrimination because people are treating you this way, and they're not seeing you as a full person. Other stereotypes about Asians, it could be like, oh, they're cheap, and so we may get worse service in a store or in a restaurant, but we're not even aware of it because this is the treatment we always get, right? But I would argue that everybody in the US experiences racism in the fact that we all hold stereotypes and we treat each other based on those stereotypes. And then because we're reacting to each other in stereotypic fashion, we do experience racism. So people who say, oh, I've never been a victim, that's not true. I think we're all victims of racism. Another quick example is what you talked about, is the lack of Asian American history. So maybe a student goes through school and never learns about Asian Americans' history in the United States. They never read any literature by Asian Americans. They never hear about the situation and experiences of Asian Americans. Why is a student, if they're Asian American, experience so erased, right? Why aren't different groups talked about? Why do we only learn primarily about white male history? And that's because certain histories get privileged and other histories get neglected. That's discrimination too, that institutionally our textbooks, our curriculum only focus on certain aspects of America and not other aspects. That's a form of discrimination that's institutional because our schools are doing it, and we don't hear about our own experiences and histories as Asian Americans. And I think that's an example of how you only get a certain perspective that discriminates against other perspectives and that don't do justice. So that's another type of racism or discrimination that a lot of students experiences. White students, they don't get to hear about Asian American history. And so they too face that kind of institutionalized racism where they don't get to hear about the diversity of America.
Also, I think there's a notion that like America, or I know like America offers courses like APUSH, which is like American history. I think going back to what you said, like Asians aren't seen as like American, they're seen as foreign. So I think that's also a reason why like Asians are often excluded from like I guess like the American history curriculum because they are seen as foreign. And I guess kind of like going back to what you said earlier about like the harmful implications of the model minority myth. For the second point, I kind of agree with that because I feel like Asian Americans, they're often used as like a tool against like or a tool for like white supremacists against like I guess like African Americans in the black community. Like I feel like Asians are used to like drive like a wedge or like used to excuse the racism that like African Americans or like the black community faces, which is like a very huge problem because then I feel like the Asian community and also like the black community get divided too in that kind of like utilization of Asians as tools.
Yeah, one example of that is in the state of Florida, where they passed a bill that says we should teach Asian American history. And Asian Americans think, oh, that's good. But then at the same time, they, like blocked AP African American history. They revised their standards. And it just shows a double standard in Florida that they'll give token representation with some Asian American curriculum, but then sort of reject African American curriculum. So what does that say to African Americans? It says, oh, we favor Asian Americans over African Americans. I think that's sort of the bottom line argument in these laws, that Asians are favored and we don't like African Americans being too woke. And I think that type of divide and conquer strategy, that you favor one group over another group, is really hurtful and damaging, and Asian Americans should actually act in solidarity and try to promote African American studies as much as we promote Asian American studies. There's a lot of educational issues where Asian Americans themselves are seeking to, get better educations, get admitted in good schools, but then that hurts other groups. And so we have to be cautious. We can't just be working for our own good, but work for the common good.
Mm-hmm. And kind of like transitioning to, I guess, like Asian hate, like forms of Asian hate have always existed, like even before the pandemic. I guess, like, why don't you think that these forms were as widely talked about before the pandemic?
Well, here where I teach, we teach a lot about it. It just depends on your school and your institution whether you get that history or not. Again, Asian Americans have a long legacy of both institutional racism, where there's laws and policies enacted against us to exclude us, to segregate us, to incarcerate us, to deport us. My family's been in the US for 6 generations. And so we experience all those things: exclusion, mass dispossession, deportation, mass detention. And so I know from personal family history that Asian Americans have long experienced institutional racism. The reasons why we don't hear about it is because, again, it actually gets erased. That, again, American educational systems favor a certain type of historical perspective that erases the stories of people of color. Beyond the institutional racism, again, the racism is intersectional, like you talked about, that women experience racism differently than men, that women were the first group Asian women were the first group excluded in America, right, by immigration laws through the 1875 Page Act. Our racism, beyond being institutional, beyond being intersectional, it's also really violent and and people don't hear about how in the 1880s over 160 Chinese communities actually got mass dispossessed, that they actually got burned down or driven out by mob violence. And so that type of violent history it often isn't discussed.
Mm-hmm. And I think not discussing these violent histories also has kind of an impact on like Asian Americans' health, because I feel like if you don't see yourself represented, then obviously I guess like like your mental health kind of goes down because you aren't just like seeing yourselves represented.
Yeah, I think currently a lot of Asian American young people, when you don't see yourself represented, you feel invisible. And when you feel invisible, you feel insignificant and irrelevant. And I think the racism plus the invisibility plus the academic pressures from the model minority all lead to a lot of mental health stress for Asian American young people.
Mm-hmm. I'm talking about Asian mental health. I think Asian, like apparently Asian Americans are the least likely to seek mental health services, and that's not because like Asian Americans like don't face mental health issues. It's more of just like, I guess like they feel as if they can't like speak up, or like they are, I guess like they maybe like feel repressed by the model minority myth, and that so they feel like they can't speak up and find mental health services. I guess like, can you kind of talk about the trend of like Asian Americans like mental health?
Yeah, I think it's clear that the racism has really impacted our mental health status, that experiencing this racial trauma, and it is traumatizing because it's led to depression, it's led to anxiety, it's led to hypervigilance and fear. That we do experience a mental health trauma, but we react differently than maybe other groups. And I don't think we need to assimilate so much that we adopt like white ways of dealing with trauma and seeking individual therapy or mental health services. I think that's one helpful way to deal with the racial trauma. But Asians, I think, like you said, don't utilize mental health services. But that doesn't mean we don't necessarily seek help. We just seek help in different ways, in Asian ways, not white ways. And so to compare ourselves, oh, we don't utilize mental health services. Well, I don't, that's okay to me because we're not necessarily white and we don't have to get help the way white people do. I think we get help in other ways that we have a lot more social supports. We help each other as a group. And so we don't need individual therapy. I think we have ways of thinking that are more interdependent. So when we face trouble, we don't just think about our own individual trouble. We think about how that trouble impacts the whole family. We think about and so I think a lot of Asians don't seek mental health, not because it's stigmatized or they don't seek help. It's because they think, I can't spend the money on myself. That's a little too selfish. And when other people have other problems, it seems sort of self-focused to pay so much attention to myself. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing that we don't just think about ourselves, but we think about others and don't want to put too much focus on ourselves. So a lot of people talk about Asians underutilizing mental health. And I go, well, maybe that's a good thing. But at the same time, I think we do get help in different ways. So be cautious in saying we need to be like white people and thinking and seeking individual therapy. That's just another a model of assimilation that's sort of dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess kind of going on, I guess like how can we as society, I know this is like kind of going off the mental health thing, but how can we society and the government provide moral support for victims of Asian hate?
Yeah, actually, in terms of mental health and providing support for Asian Americans, I think Asians actually have some pretty strong cultural resources and historic um, traditions that actually are really beneficial for a society's mental health. I think, first of all, we, again, are more collective in nature, whereas America is really individualistic. And you could see that in Western models of therapy is that you go and do individual talk therapy about your individual issues. But if you come from a more collective community like Asians, then you bring social support. You may feel like you're going through trouble, but you don't feel so bad because you have a lot of people around you also dealing with it and also taking care of each other. And so I think what America needs to be is more Asian than it is American, in that we should be less independent and lonely and more collective and supporting each other. Instead of thinking self-care, we need to develop community care. And that collective orientation that a lot of groups have, that Asians particularly value, I think needs to be promoted more. We need more collective places where people could come together and support each other and talk about mental health. So that's just one example. Another example of how Asian Americans may have better mental health beyond just being more supportive of each other and being more group oriented is that we have traditions like Buddhism, like Taoism, where you expect to have suffering. Suffering is normalized. Whereas in America, everybody thinks, oh, we should be like in Disneyland and be happy all the time. We're entitled to happiness and fun. And so when racism occurs, young people are just shocked and think, oh, this is terrible. This isn't fair. Whereas older people think, yeah, life isn't fair. People aren't fair. And so they're not as stunned by adversity. So actually having a tradition where you expect adversity and then know how to deal with it is actually really helpful. So if Asian Americans go back to their religious traditions, they wouldn't be as shocked by racism, but maybe be prepared on how to deal with it the way our elders have dealt with violence and war and suffering. So I think those are just two examples of how Asians have strong mental health resources that broader America could also learn from. As first of all, to learn to be more collective and more providing of social support, and secondly, not to be so entitled to expect happiness all the time, but instead expect suffering to come, and then how to work in solidarity with people to address those times of suffering. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think I'm trying to promote, let's use the strengths of our Asian American community to address mental health and not try to adopt white models of how to become mentally healthy.
Mhm. And I guess like what talking about community, like what has the way in which like the AAPI community has like rallied together after that hate and rise in Asian hate told you about the AAPI community and like the
No,
solidarity?
good transition. So in times of trauma, you've heard people respond through fight or flight. When faced by danger, people flee and they run away from it, or they fight back to the danger. But there's another response that's evolutionarily, biologically adaptive. And beyond going into a fight or flight response to dangers, you can flock, right? So you could think of animals or birds flocking in the face of threat. And I think Asian Americans have flocked too in the face of racial trauma and threat. We flocked to take care of our families, and we thought about our elders and told them to stay indoors. We flocked at rallies and vigils to mourn over the Atlanta shootings. We flocked to help support depressed ethnic enclaves like Chinatowns. We flocked to help chaperone our elders to go shopping. So I've seen the Asian American community really utilize, again, their collective orientation, really build on the social support networks that they have to really come together during this time. That's why the Stop AAPI Hate movement has been so large, is because we've come together, not just to protect ourselves individually, but to protect our families. Again, that collective orientation really kicked in, and we flocked to take care of each other. The reason why I think the movement grew so large is because students weren't just thinking about themselves, they were thinking about their grandparents who were getting attacked, right? They weren't just thinking about themselves, they were thinking about their little siblings who were getting bullied. So I think, again, that collective orientation has really led to this movement of like, this is wrong, we got to address it. And so I've really seen the community multi-generationally stand up to the racism. Even elders, we at Stop AAPI Hate got a lot of responses from elders, and you don't think of older people going online and complaining, but they did to us because they knew it was wrong and wanted to make change. So I think, again, Asian Americans of all generations, of all ethnicities, really stood up during this time, worked in their churches and temples, worked in schools, worked in corporations, worked in media to really to stop the racism and to take a stand against it. So I've been really proud of the community. And I saw during the pandemic, a lot of corporations, a lot of like sports teams really stand up to the racism. So I'm really proud of how the community responded.
Hmm. I feel like being a community and like being collective shouldn't be thought of as like something like only when I guess like troubles or like hardships arise. I feel like being in solidarity should be seen as like a verb, I guess, and just like always rallying together even when there aren't like
Yeah,
specific instances of like racism or like only
and,
during the hardships.
and we are always verbing in solidarity and collectivity. And because we're already sort of in those networks, in those family groupings, in those sort of religious networks, that's why we were able to mobilize quickly, right? And so we were celebrating birthdays, we were holding traditional festivals, we were already organized in corporate affinity groups, so that when hard times come, then we're ready to take action. And so I think during the pandemic, new groups started, but we were also able to mobilize on our collective orientation that was already there and then make change.
Hmm. And then I guess my last kind of question to you would be like, how can we as like everyday ordinary citizens like rally together and stop Asian hate?
Ordinary citizens, I guess there's lots of ways you can do it. First of all, like listening to this podcast, you become educated, more aware of the issues. But awareness is just the first step, right? Then you have to take action on what you know. And one way you could take action is by joining organizations, student clubs, um, you know, neighborhood groups, political organizations, because as I've been saying, we have more power collectively. And if we could take organizational action, if we could take collective action, that gives us a greater voice. So I think acting as groups rather than acting as individuals is much more powerful. And so I really encourage Asian Americans to come together as formal organizations and say, it's not just me as Tiffany standing out against hate, but me as my student group or me as my neighborhood group taking a stand. I
Mm-hmm.
think, and then beyond taking the step from becoming individually aware to acting as a group, and then think about policy change, because policies are what affect a lot of people. Policies are what are long-term policies, really do um, make change even if the group leaves. And so I think trying to figure out what policies need to be changed, like maybe at a school, you need to have curriculum that teaches Asian American studies. Maybe in a community, you need funding to help fund Asian American groups. Those are the types of policy changes that last even past the group and then help future generations. So I think for me, making policy change is a more effective way of making long-term change.
Mm-hmm. Also, just like, I guess, like, I feel like the youth should also feel like they have a part in this because I feel like the youth, current youth, like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they have a lot of power, and I feel like they have more power than they think they do. Or
Yeah,
like,
they really do. You know, the push for Asian American studies at the K through 12 level is nationwide, and they're all spawned by student groups, right? So 20 states are now proposing or enacting this type of legislation to teach Asian American studies in our public schools. Again, students had a lot of say in that. They rallied, they testified saying, this would actually improve my education. I would actually learn more. And, school boards care what students think because that's why they're in a school board. School boards care about what the parents think, and so if kids could get their parents out, that's really powerful. So students have a lot of voice in saying, I want to learn about this. Usually students don't seem to care about what they learn about, so any student who says, I want to learn about this, can we have this kind of reading, can we have this type of literature, that's really powerful. And I think people would be responsive if students really said, let's have this kind of class, let's have this kind of curriculum, and then they were more engaged. Why wouldn't school boards and teachers want to adopt curriculum that students are excited about? So yes, students should start petitioning, get their classmates involved, and that's also really helpful in reducing anti-Asian hate. When people sign a petition and say, I want to learn about Asian American authors, and when other students sign it, it makes them think, okay, if I want to learn about Asian American authors, I shouldn't treat my classmates badly, right? So I think it's a good way to both fight racism on the interpersonal level, but also make institutional change. And students have a lot of voice in their educational arenas.
mhm. Yeah, I think the conclusion here is that the youth should utilize their voices. And yeah, I guess thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much, Professor Jeung, for speaking here and giving me the opportunity to speak with you. It was so fun. Thank you so much. And to everyone at home watching, thank you so much. And I'll see everyone next time. Bye.